Over the many years, the northeast of England and the border country of Scotland have been renowned for the many shepherds that have built a reputation for themselves as top sheepdog handlers and breeders. The hill country of Northumbria has been ideal for these many shepherds and farmers to work and train their dogs. This is a country where, for hundreds of years, sheep have thrived on the rugged hills of heather and grass, an area that has proved itself as a breeding ground for top-quality replacement half-bred ewes. The shepherds that manage these vast pastures live a unique and traditional way of life. Their methods of working have allowed them to remain isolated from the move into our modern ways of farming. A strong crook and a sound pony and a wise and willing border collie remain the strength of these hill shepherds. The county of Northumberland is in the northeast of England. It is a land of spectacular scenery, of in-by farms that rise up to the rugged hills, and valleys where stone walls meet quiet rural communities. The heart of Northumberland is the town of Alnwick, and its ancient castle, the home of the Duke of Northumberland. Alnwick Castle was also to be the site for the finals of the 1990 International Sheepdog Trials. In 1989, the finals were held at Margam Park in South Wales. It was at this trial that Bobby Dyell and his young dog Wisp, after narrowly qualifying for the final day, managed to edge out John Templeton and Roy to win the highest honour in the sheepdog competitions, that of the Supreme International Championship. Another notable accomplishment at the 1989 trial was Julie Deptford's high-scoring qualifying run with her young dog Gwen. It was a run that placed her in the lead heading into the finals, the first time that a woman has ever achieved this position. As usual, the first 2 days of International were made up of the qualifying runs, and also the finals of the Brace Championships. In all, 57 handlers earned the position to compete for their countries in this year's qualifying trial, representing the 4 countries of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. The course for the qualifying trial was as follows. The gather. In the outrun, the dog may be sent out on either side for the sheep some 400 yards away. The sheep should be brought on a direct line through a set of gates approximately 150 yards from the handler's post. No retry at the gates is allowed. The handler must remain at the post throughout the gather, and then at the end of the fetch he must pass the sheep behind him onto the start of the drive. The score for the outrun is 20, the lift 10, and the fetch 20. The drive. The sheep must be driven on a triangular course of some 450 yards, through 2 sets of drive gates, and then return the sheep to the shedding ring. The handler must remain at the post until all of the sheep have entered the shedding ring, at which point the drive is completed. No retry at either sets of gates is allowed. The score for the drive is 30 points. For the 1990 qualifying trials, the drive was to the right, away from the handler. The shed. 2 of the unmarked sheep must be shed off within the boundaries of the shedding ring, which is some 40 yards in diameter. Once the shed has been taken, the dog must show control over the shed sheep. Once completed, all the sheep must be regathered. The score for the shed is 10 points. The pen. On completion of the shed, the handler must proceed to the pen, leaving the dog to bring the sheep to him. The handler must stand at the gate holding the 6-foot rope, and must not let go of it, whilst the dog works the sheep into the pen. The handler must then close the gate, at which point the pen is considered completed. After releasing the sheep, the handler must close the gate before returning to the shedding ring. The score for the pen is 10 points. The single. The handler must proceed to the shedding ring, leaving the dog to bring the sheep to the ring. At that point, one of the two marked sheep must be shed off within the boundaries of the shedding ring. At that point, the dog must show control over the shed sheep. The score for the single is 10 points. Once the single sheep is taken, the course is completed. This allows for a total of 110 points per judge, for a total of 440 points, and a time limit of 15 minutes is allowed. On the first day of qualifying, some 32 handlers went to the post. Tim Longton of Quernmore, Lancashire, with his 3-year-old dog Glenn, was the second handler in the English team to run on the Thursday. This young dog is out of K.C. Powell's Fly and sired by Sidney Price's Davy. He had a good run for a score of 329 out of the possible 440, the highest so far for the day. He lost some points right at the start, taking a direct line to the sheep before turning back without direction from Tim for a good sweep around to the back of the ewes. He lifted the sheep well off the release point and managed a good line on the fetch, with the ewes forcing to the right-hand side of the course. The first part of the drive went well, but finished up with the ewes missing the drive panels. The cross drive was on a good line, and this time he managed to negotiate the sheep between the gates. He scored well through to the single, but would have lost some points here with the sheep leaving the shedding ring before the single was taken. The well-known Welsh handler, Selwyn Jones, who farms near the town of Festiniog, ran in 7th spot with his 3-year-old dog Merc. Merc is a son of John Griffith's prick-eared dog Glenn, a former Welsh national champion. Merc is also a brother to John Griffith's own Sweep, that took John to the 1989 International at Margam Park. This run scored Selwyn 339 points. He had a good outrun with the ewes breaking on the lift. This was managed well, but took the sheep offline to the start of the fetch. Selwyn brought the ewes back online and finished well, bringing the ewes through the gates and then tight around the handler's post, losing a few points at the beginning of the drive with the ewes splitting. Once through the first gates, the sheep went on to a poor line for the start of the cross-drive, but finished well taking the cross-drive panels and then returning to the shedding ring. By this time in the day, it was becoming quite obvious that the pen was going to be quite a problem for the handlers and dogs. The sheep on the first day were flighty at best, and it was hard to settle them at the pen to allow the dog to work the sheep into the opening. Like with so many of the runs, points would have been lost here. Selwyn went on to complete the course with a good and decisive single. Billy Elliott, a shepherd from Yetham, near Kelso, was the third handler to represent Scotland. His 7-year-old Gale is a son of Redpath's Ben and Pringle's Dusk. This run was to give Billy and Gale the highest scoring run for the day at 375. After a well-made outrun, he would have lost some points at the start of the fetch. He finished the fetch on a good line though, and with the ewes still drawing hard to the right-hand side of the course, he had probably the best drive so far on the first day. He went on to score well with a decisive shed, and then managed to pen the sheep right away without the ewes breaking past to the far right of the field, as was the case with most of the runs so far. A point would have been lost, though, on the single, with the marked sheep being taken on a second try. Glyn Jones came to the British International with his 6-year-old Cap, a son of his well-known dog Bull Taff. Glyn is no stranger on the national and international trial field, with 1 Supreme Championship and 2 Welsh Championships to his credit. In all, he has represented his country of Wales some 16 times. Cap had a good outrun and then went on to control the sheep well through the fetch to the handler's post. He would have lost considerable points missing the drive panels, and then went on to recover with a good cross drive, successfully negotiating the cross drive gates before returning to the shedding ring. More points would have been lost at the shed with a couple of failed tries, and then with the sheep leaving the boundaries of the ring. The ewes were handled well at the pen, stopping any breaks away. Once the single sheep was taken, Glyn scored a respectable 339, to equal Selwyn Jones's score with his 3-year-old dog Murph. Katie Cropper had managed to qualify 2 dogs for the International. Competing for the English team, she had been the first handler to the post on the Thursday morning with her 4-year-old dog Trim. With this run, she was beaten by the clock, and so only managed a score of 240 points. Her second dog is 3-year-old Max, a great-grandson of the 1977 Supreme Champion, John Thomas's Craig. Max started the run with a fairly direct outrun. 1 whistle command corrected this, finishing well behind the ewes. From the lift, the sheep were handled well on a good fetch, around the handler's post and onto a top-scoring drive and cross-drive. Once again, the shed proved a stumbling block. A lot of time was taken up before the shed was taken. Although the ewes came well to the pen, they broke past, and from then on, with all the effort in the world, Katie and Max couldn't keep the sheep in the gate opening long enough to settle them and to work them into the pen to get the gate closed. As was the case with her first run, Katie ran out of time. Her score of 321 was evidence, though, of the quality of run she had managed up until the shed and pen. Jock Welsh drew 17th spot on the first day of qualifying. Jock and his 4-year-old dog Watty came to Alnwick representing his home country of Scotland. Watty's breeding goes back to Jock Patterson's York and Dye, and to Dick Fortune's Glen as grandsire. It was on the first part of the course that this team lost most of their points, with Watty taking a very wide outrun far back of the ewes. They then had a poor lift, but started to regain some position on the fetch. They ended with a good fetch and then had a good drive and cross drive, finishing back at the shedding ring on a correct line. The shed was taken well after a little time, and then high points would have been given with the penning. The single was taken well, leaving Jock with a score of 329. Ireland had 12 handlers in the 1990 International. The strength of their team grows as the years go by. This year, Dennis Burchell and Tim Flood, both who have represented Ireland for the last number of years, failed to make the qualifying trials. However, Tim Flood did come to Northumberland with Pip and Flash to compete in this year's brace finals. Chris McNaughton was the fourth Irishman to run on the first day. This was with his very young dog Spy. At 2 years and 5 months, Spy had to be one of the youngest dogs competing this year. His outrun started well, but ended with Spy stopping short for the lift, causing the ewes to move away to the left of the course. Once Chris had things back on line again, they went on to finish the fetch on a good line, losing significant points when the ewes narrowly missed taking the fetch gates. He regained some points on his drive and cross drive, losing points again on a wide turn around the cross drive gates, and then a poor line back to the shedding ring. The shed was taken after several tries. He would have lost some points at the pen, but then managed to settle the sheep well enough to work them in to close the gate. He completed the course scoring well with the single and finishing with a score of 324. John Angus MacLeod, one of the most notable characters on the national and international trial field, ran his 7-year-old Taff for the Scottish team. Taff is out of Ray Edwards' bet and a full brother to the 6-year-old Glenn that Ray qualified with both this year and also in 1989 at Margam. The run started well with a good outrun, lift and fetch, keeping the ewes well on line to the handler's post. The drive and cross drive were very steady, almost too steady, using up too much of the valuable time. He finished the drive well on a good line to the shedding ring. The shed was taken in fairly good time, but was not very decisive. This would have cost him some points. Time ran out at the pen, leaving Taff and John Angus with a score of 305. The strength of the Welsh team this year was very evident. Mervyn Williams continued to show his abilities in the Welsh National, qualifying to represent Wales for the 15th time. From his farm near the English border in Radnorshire, he travelled the length of England with his stylish and careful bitch Nell to compete at Alnwick. Nell is a 5-year-old daughter from John James's Ben and out of Renshaw's Biddy. Mervyn lost points at the end of the outrun, with Nell stopping short of the balance point before being whistled back to a position to lift the ewes. Once there, she lifted the sheep well and went on to a good fetch, finishing the fetch and turning the sheep tightly around the handler's post onto the start of the drive. The whole of the drive was carefully and accurately handled, with Nell taking lots of time and keeping the ewes very steady and settled. Once at the shedding ring, points would have been lost with Nell rushing at the sheep, but the shed was taken, and on this second attempt the gate was closed at the pen. Time ran out though whilst attempting the single, leaving Mervyn and Nell with a score of 312 points. The name Pat Burns is well known throughout Great Britain as belonging to experience and understanding of Border Collie dogs. Pat Burns Sr. has represented Ireland on many occasions, and over the last number of years the maturity of a seasoned handler has shown itself in his son, Pat Burns Jr. Pat Jr., with his strong and willing Dot, has also represented Ireland in many competitions, winning a position in the finals of the 1988 One Man and His Dog series. He represented Ireland at Margam Park last year, and has once again won a position in the Irish team, this time at Alnwick Castle. Dot is a daughter of Watson's Mossy and the well-known John Templeton's Roy, a grandson of John Templeton's Moss. The run started well with an excellent outrun, stopping a little short of balance, but in a good position to correct the sheep as they pressed to the right-hand side of the course. He had a good lift and line to the fetch gates, losing some points on the line on the last part of the fetch to the handler's post. The sheep were turned well onto the start of the drive, keeping a good line and strong pressure to stop the sheep from breaking down the field. The finish of the cross drive was well executed, with the sheep coming around the gate and onto a good line to the shedding ring. The shed took a fair amount of work, but was decisively taken before running out of time at the pen. Even with the last two parts of the course unfinished, they still managed a score of 315. In 1988, Marion Jones and Spot travelled to Blair Athol in Perthshire, Scotland, to represent the Welsh team at the British International. He returned to his home in Clwyd, North Wales, the supreme international champion and winner of the most prestigious award on the trial courses throughout the world. This year he again travelled north, but this time to the fields of Alnwick, where he became part of one of the most influential Welsh teams ever put together. In 1990, Wales brought together 5 handlers that have won the Supreme over the past years, and those 5 handlers had 8 international wins to their credit, and 8 of the Welsh team have managed to win their national championship. The names of the Welsh team sound of the recent history and successes of the British Border Collie world. Gwyn Jones, Erwin Daniels, Wyn Edwards, Marion Jones, and Glyn Jones. Marion had been absent from the 1989 line-up at Margam Park, and so this year wanted to make sure he could find a position in the finals on the Saturday. At the start of the run, Spot came in well before reaching the distance of the sheep, and so had to be whistled back out. Once at the back of the sheep, he managed a good lift and very direct line on his fetch. He turned the sheep tightly around the handler's post and then onto an accurate drive and cross drive, all of which would have recovered him well following his poor outrun. Once in the shedding ring, it took a short time before everything was properly in place to take the shed. The pen again, like with so many others, caused its grief, but once the pen was made, Spot brought the ewes back to the shedding ring for a good decisive single. The 365 score ended up being the second highest of the day, behind Billy Elliott 375 with Gale. A familiar face at both the Scottish Nationals and also the British Internationals is Stuart Davidson. Stuart farms near Dunoon in Scotland, and over the last 10 years has had many successes. In partnership with Ben, he went ahead and won the 1980 Scottish Championship, the 1981 Scottish Brace Championship along with his other dog Shep, and then the One Man and His Dog Championship also in 1981. Then, with his dog Chief, he went on to win the 1988 and 1989 Scottish Championship. After winning the captain's position for the 1989 trial at Margam Park, he was unable to travel to Wales to play a part in their team's success for that year. This year he had managed to qualify 2 dogs for the qualifying trials, and also to win a position to represent Scotland in the brace finals with his 2 dogs Chief and Moss. This is the first of his runs on the Thursday. His final score of 2.98 showed up some of the problems that Stewart ran into. He had a good outrun and lift, but then lost valuable fetch points missing the gates. The start of his drive was on line, but his cross drive was high, and then losing a lot of points hooking the sheep back through the cross drive gates. The last part of the drive was on a good line back to the shedding ring. The shed was taken well, and the pen was made on the second attempt. The finish of the run, the single, was soon taken, but many valuable points had been lost, too many to find him a place in the finals on Saturday. With the first day of qualifying over, the 32 runs scored like this. Katie Cropper, with trim, ran out of time and scored 240 on the first run of the day. Billy Elliott, the shepherd, from Yetham near Kelso, managed the highest scoring run of the day. Glyn Jones had a very respectable score of 339, enough to find him a place in the finals on Saturday. Colin Gordon, who had won reserve champion in the brace finals at Margam Park in 1989, had a disappointing run with his 3-year-old Cap, losing points by missing both of his drive gates and then running out of time at the pen. John Thomas, the well-known Welshman who shepherds in Gloucestershire and runs for the English team, came to Alnwick with his 9-year-old Moss. He lost points when missing the fetch and drive gates, and then running out of time trying to complete the pen. Stuart Davidson's luck didn't improve at all when he ran his second dog, his 7-year-old Moss, for the last run of the day. So, for this year, Stuart wasn't able to find a position to compete for the championship. The second day started clear and sunny. Johnny Bathgate was one of the first competitors, running his 9-year-old Vic for Scotland. Vic is a son of John Templeton's Roy and out of Bar's Jen. He had a good start to the run with a good outrun and lift, the dog keeping well off the sheep, allowing them to start the fetch well settled. Right through the fetch he kept a clean line through the gates and then on to the handler's post. The sheep were wide around the post, but managed to find a good line on the drive. The quality of the run continued through the cross drive and back to the shedding ring. The shed was taken almost immediately, and then the pen completed, with the sheep breaking away from the mouth of the pen once. With the pen and the single completed, they managed the highest score so far in the qualifying trials, with a total of 386.5. The next handler to compete represented Wales. Aled Owen, a young farmer from the hills of Corran in Clwyd, was running his 8-year-old Ben, a team that managed the Welsh National Championship in 1985. Ben is a son of Edward Zack and out of Williams Fan. This run was to score Aled a high 352, quite easily enough to find him a place in the finals. The main places that points were lost were on the fetch, which was somewhat offline, and then missing the fetch gates. Then more points were lost on the cross drive. Here the sheep went too high, ending up missing the gates altogether. He recovered well with an excellent pen and then a top-scoring single. Four of this year's Irish team have, over the last number of years, won the Irish National Championship. One of them is John Brennan, a farmer from Templemore, County Tipperary. At Alnwick this year, he ran his keen little bitch, Meg. The beginning of the outrun saw quite a few points lost, with John having to whistle Meg in after starting the outrun very wide. By the time she had reached the lift point, the ewes were well offline. However, this was recovered, and then the ewes went onto a good line to the handler. The start to the drive was straight, but a mistake at the first drive gates almost had the sheep missing the panels. Although this was corrected in time, a few more points would have gone when Meg took the wrong side command to turn the ewes, leaving a wide and high start with the cross drive. The remainder of the course regained John some needed points, finishing with a 328, but still not enough to qualify for the finals. For those who have had the opportunity to travel to the international trials in Britain, it quickly becomes apparent that the top handlers become regular competitors. For the English team, Thomas Longton has managed to show continued form representing his country in both the singles and in the brace finals over the last number of years. Along with Thomas, his 7-year-old Tweed has also become well known, especially in partnership in the brace competitions with his half-sister Jem. This year, Tweed and Thomas showed their consistency by scoring a strong 383 to win a place for the finals. The whole run was well executed, with no major mistakes throughout the whole course. Some points would have gone at the end of the fetch, with the sheep keeping wide around the handler's post, and then somewhat offline on the last part of the drive on the return to the shedding ring. The shed was taken well, but points would have gone at the pen when one of the ewes was allowed to break back. It was a run that was to place Thomas and Tweed in the second place so far in the qualifying trials, with some 39 runs being completed. Boyd Mundell's run, with his 5-year-old Jen, scored a respectable 324. The start to the run went well, with a good outrun, with Jen looking back for the sheep as she went on out to her balance point. Her fetch, though, was offline, which then caused the sheep to miss the panels. Once past the gates, the fetch line continued to be crooked, and so quite a few points would have been lost by the time the drive started. The first part of the drive was taken well, but the cross drive ended up with the sheep being too high and then missing the panels. Once back at the shedding ring, Boyd and Jen sorted the 2 unmarked sheep immediately and took the shed. The penning was well controlled, with the ewes taking their time to turn in past the opening to allow the gate to be closed. The run was finished with a quick and decisive single. The second highest scoring run on the last day of the qualifying went to Wyn Edwards and his 7-year-old Don. Don is a son of Wyn's own Bill and out of Owen's Fly. Wyn is no stranger to the national and international trial fields either, winning the British International in both 1981 and again in 1982, with Bill the father of the qualifier for this year. In this run, only a few points would have been lost on the first part of the course, with the ewes being kept well settled and on a good line all the way round through the fetch and onto the drive. A top score would have been given for the drive and the cross drive, but points would have gone on the turn to the shedding ring, with Don taking the wrong side and bringing the sheep well offline. Although a fair amount of time was taken in sorting the single, the shed and the pen were well executed, leaving a score of 393, a score that would end up being the second highest over the 2 days of qualifying. 4-year-old Fly is a daughter of the well-known Dryden Joe. Under the guidance of her handler, Erwin Daniel, she had managed to qualify for the Welsh team this year. Erwin is one of the 5 Welsh handlers that qualified for the 1990 Welsh team that had previously won the Supreme Trophy. It was back in 1960, when the finals were held at Blackpool, that Erwin managed to win the cup, at that time running a dog called Ken. For this year's qualifying trial, this team went on to score a high 391, easily finding a place for the finals. Points would have been lost though with a poor lift, but recovering with a good finish to his fetch, and then on to a careful and accurate drive and cross drive. The last part of the drive, the return to the shedding ring, was offline and so would have cost some points. Although the shed and the single were both taken immediately, a few points would have been lost at the pen, with a ewe breaking back from the main group. This was well recovered, and then the pen was made. Colin Gordon came to Alnwick with 2 dogs qualified for the International. Colin farms on the Gower Peninsula in Wales and has been a strong competitor for many years, winning the brace finals of the One Man and His Dog series in 1986 in the Tyne Valley. His earlier run with his 3-year-old Cap saw some of the problems that most of the handlers experienced with the strong and forceful sheep that were released on the first day, and like so many of those runs, only managed a score in the mid-200s. The sheep on the second day seemed more settled and continually allowed runs of much higher scores than on the first day of qualifying. His second dog that he ran was 9-year-old Meg, from Robbie and Nell, both of his own breeding. The first part of the run scored well with a good outrun, lift and fetch. Missing the drive panels would have cost the run, but the remainder of the drive went well. The shed took some extra time, with a good opportunity missed, but once the shed was taken, the pen and the single were securely made, leaving the run with a score of 371. Johnny Wilson is another handler that has competed for many years on the trial fields in Britain. In 1989, he travelled to Margam Park with his 8-year-old Peg to represent Scotland. This year, he had qualified with 4-year-old Spot, daughter of Peg and Raymond McPherson's Cap. In both 1986 and in 1987, Johnny Wilson and Peg had successfully captured the Shepherd's Championship. The breeding of Spot and Peg go back to J.R. Thomas's Craig and Tom Watson's Jen. The first part of this run was well made. After a left-hand outrun, Spot stopped a little past the line of the sheep. Before she made the lift, the sheep had moved offline to the right side of the course. Some pointer would have been lost here before starting off on the fetch. At the shedding ring, a lot of time was taken before the 2 unmarked sheep were shed off. Here too points would have gone, before finishing the course with a good penning and single. Their final score was 357. There are few handlers that have had continued success ranging over a long period of time. Many handlers manage great heights with a particular dog, to never quite reach those peaks again with another dog. One exception, though, is the Welshman Gwyn Jones from Penmachno in North Wales. In the mid-1970s, he managed to win the Supreme Championship on 2 occasions, with his 2 dogs, Shep and Bill. His present dog, Queen, has won the Welsh National in 1987, and then the One Man and His Dog Championship in 1988, and also competing for Wales in 3 previous internationals. To watch this bright and fiery little dog work has to be one of the highlights of any handler's fancy. The accuracy that Queen takes her commands are so easily seen and have to be admired. Gwyn achieved the only score of the qualifying trial that exceeded the 400 mark. With 430.5, this team went on to lead the field into the last days of the finals. The 1989 qualifying trials are remembered for the grand run that Julie Deptford had to be the first woman to win the qualifying trials with her young dog Gwen. This qualifying event will be remembered by the outstanding run of Gwyn and Queen and the margin of points that he led the field going into the finals. The final 4 handlers that compete in the qualifying trials out of the total of 57 are the captains of the individual teams. These competitors achieve this position by winning the national championships in their own countries. This year, the English National was held near Dorking in the south of England and was won by the young farmer from West Sleddale in Cumbria, John Harrison, and his 5-year-old dog Craig. Craig is a son of John Templeton's Roy and Ferguson's Jen, a daughter of Stuart Davidson's Ben, the 1980 Scottish national champion. This team of John and Craig managed a good run through to the shedding ring, losing points on the line of the ewes at the start of the fetch and onto the start of the drive. The ewes were kept on a good line on the cross drive and taken tightly around the panels, losing some more points again on the line to the shedding ring. With the shed taken, a few points went with the ewes breaking past the pen before being regathered and successfully penned. Finally, the single was taken, leaving John with a score of 354, easily enough to find a place for the last day of competition. For 1990, Joe McRobert won the Scottish National Championship with his 6-year-old Glenn, a son of Alistair McRae's Merc. In the qualifying trial on Friday, he managed to direct the sheep around the course for a score of 388. With a good outrun and fetch, Glenn went on to drive the sheep on a good line on the first part of the drive, and then scoring well on the cross drive before returning the ewes to the shedding ring. It took quite a few minutes before Joe managed to position the ewes for the shed. Once the shed was taken, the ewes went to the pen but ran past it to lose the run a few more points. Once in position this time, the ewes went in, and then returning to the shedding ring to take a quick and decisive single. Ireland's captain for this year was 21-year-old Toddy Lamb from County Wexford in Ireland. Toddy won the 1990 Irish National with his 6-year-old Nell, a stylish and careful little dog. Nell's grandfather was the famous Irish dog Tim Flood Scott, the Irish National winner in 1978. Scott was also the father of Pip, the dog that Tim Flood captained the Irish team with last year at Margam Park. This was the last run of the qualifying trials, and one that would take this pair to a score of 350 points. Mostly, the course was handled well, with one big problem being that the sheep continually separated, making every aspect of the course harder than was necessary. The pen caused some problems, having difficulty in moving the sheep up to the pen to allow Toddy to close the gate. Eventually the gate closed, and it only took a few minutes before this pair lined the ewes up and then the single was taken. And so ended the 2 days of qualifying. This is how the scores on the second day ended up. Marion Owen had started the day with his father's dog Rock, but ran out of time trying for the single. John Bathgate had the first high-scoring run of the day with Vic at 386.5. Then Thomas Longton with Tweed managed another good score of 383, losing points on line on the last part of the drive, and then with some problems at the pen. Wyn Edwards managed the first score over 390 so far in the qualifying event, with his 7-year-old Don at 393. This was closely contested soon afterwards by Erwin Daniels and his 4-year-old Fly, a daughter of Bobby Dial's Dryden Joe, and with a score of 391. Alistair McRae, competing for Scotland, had managed a respectable 389 with his 5-year-old Butte, and close behind was Colin Gordon with 371 with Meg, a 9-year-old dog of his own breeding. The highlight of the day was the terrific run of Gwyn Jones and Queen, topping the 2 days with a remarkable 430.5 points, nearly 40 points ahead of the second-place team of Wyn Edwards. The Welsh captain, Hefan Jones, had a disappointing day, having to whistle his dog out a number of times on the outrun, and then going on to miss the fetch gates, finally running out of time at the pen. Many of the shepherds of Northumberland have worked with sheep and border collies for much of their lives. The main sheep areas that are associated with this part of the country are the border regions of England and Scotland, and the vast open hills and mountains that make up much of this grazing land. Many of these shepherds have managed to lease some of these hill farms from the large estates of this border region. Paul Turnbull is just one of these men. Coming from a strong background of hill farming and shepherding, Paul's dream of working his own farm and tending his own flock took him to the rugged hills above Rothbury and onto the 1,800-acre Debden farm, part of the Craigside estate. This is by no means the lush pastures that so many associate with English countryside. Rather, it is made up of rock and heather, strong winds and driving rains. This is a country where 1 ewe needs up to 3 acres to survive, and a land where the shepherd's only tool is his dog. Apart from at lambing time in the spring, the ewes graze the remainder of the year high up on the peaks overlooking the kinder grounds far below. On this type of farm, the Scottish blackface has become the predominant breed of ewe, a hardy type with its long coarse wool and its mean ability to survive in these conditions. Many of these shepherds compete at sheepdog trials, whilst others have carried on the old craft of crook-making. It soon becomes obvious why this part of Britain has become so well known for its master stick dressers. The concern over portraying the subject with complete accuracy is taken to its limits. Every subject is studied with unequalled care. Some of these crooks have taken over 500 hours to make, and so allowing only 3 or 4 of these masterpieces to be completed by each stick dresser in a year. An important part of the British international trials is the finals of the Brace Championship. Each country is represented by 2 handlers, and so 8 runs are made altogether. This is broken down to 4 runs on the Thursday, and then the last 4 on the Friday. On each of these days, 1 handler is represented from each country. Out of the 8 handlers this year, 3 of them had represented their countries in 1989 at Margam Park. These were Thomas Longton, Tim Flood and Jim Dyson from Wales. The other 5 competitors are no strangers to the British trial fields. Mrs. Viv Billingham and Stuart Davidson made up the Scottish team, whilst Tim Longton made up the second competitor representing England. Pat Byrne Jr. competed for Ireland, and finally J.R. Griffith from Carnarvon represented Wales. The course for the brace is as follows. The gather. 10 sheep in one lot will be released in the centre of the field at approximately 800 yards. Both dogs will start at the same time. Crossing at the completion of the outrun is permissible, but dogs should remain on the side to which they have crossed, and they should not recross. The fetch should be straight through a set of gates 9 yards wide in the centre of the field. Should the gates be missed, no retry is allowed. Each dog will keep to its own side, and the handler will remain at the post, and at the end of the fetch will pass the sheep behind him. The drive. The handler stands at the post and directs his 2 dogs to drive the sheep 600 yards over a triangular course through 2 sets of gates 9 yards wide, and back to the handler. No retry is allowed at either gate. Each dog is to keep to its own side, and the handler must remain at the post until the end of the drive. The drive is finished when the sheep enter the shedding ring. The shed. The shed will be divided into 2 equal lots by either dog inside the shedding ring. One lot will be penned in a diamond-shaped pen with an entrance of 5 feet and no gate. This dog will be left in charge, whilst the other 5 sheep are penned by the other dog, in a similar pen approximately 50 yards away. The scores are for the gathering, 80 points, which is 20 points for the lift, 20 points for fetch, and 40 points for the outrun. There are 30 points for the drive, 10 points for the shed, and 20 points in total for the penning. This gives a total of 140 points per judge and an aggregate of 560, with a time limit of 25 minutes. Thomas Longton and his 2 dogs, Jem and Tweed, representing England, were the first to run on the Thursday. Thomas had a good start with an accurate outrun, and the 2 dogs lifting the sheep well onto the start of the fetch. They maintained a good line right the way through to the handler's post, and then onto the start of the drive. By this time on the Thursday, most of the handlers had come to realize that the ewes were naturally forcing to the right-hand side of the course. Thomas and his 2 dogs managed this well. Things, unfortunately, started going wrong at the first drive panels, ending up with some of the sheep missing the gates. Following a rather expensive drive, the shed was taken decisively. Once the penning was completed, this run of Thomas Longton's scored him 387 points. Mrs. Viv Billingham is a well-known personality in the Border Collie world, both in Britain and abroad. In partnership with her husband Jeff, they run a shepherding and Border Collie centre at Tweedsmuir in Peeblesshire, Scotland. Viv came to Alnwick with her 2 dogs, Holly and Tweedhope Glen. Glen is a son of his partner in this brace championship, and sired by Jeff Billingham's Cap. The 289 score that she received was a reflection of the very disappointing gather that this team had. Although one of the dogs arrived behind the ewes for the lift, the second dog played no part at all in the run until well on into the fetch. Because of this, the sheep were badly offline to the handler's post. Once on the drive, then things improved dramatically with an excellent drive and cross drive, bringing the ewes back to the shedding ring on a good line. With the shed soon taken, Viv went on to the penning. The second pen was completed well, but some points would have gone on the first pen, with the ewes running past several times before Viv eventually managed to pen them. The last run on the Thursday was with Jim Dyson and his two dogs Nap and Flint, running for Wales. Here they ran into much the same problems as Viv Billingham did on the previous run, with the right-hand dog running out further than his other dog, leaving only one of the dogs working the sheep on the fetch to the handler. This was very costly, losing much of the points on a poor line, missing the gates, and one of the dogs hanging way back from the stock on the right-hand hill. The remainder of the run went fairly well, completing the course with a score of 279. The second day saw easier working ewes that weren't constantly forcing to the right-hand corner of the field. The second handler to represent Ireland was Pat Byrne Jr., with his two dogs Star and Dot, both sired by John Templeton's Roy. He started the course with the best outrun so far in the brace finals, with both of his dogs arriving behind the sheep at the same time, then crossing over to lift the ewes onto the start of the fetch. Although the fetch was kept on a good line, the sheep narrowly avoided the gates, but then carrying on well to the handler's post, but it would have cost some points. Once around the post, the ewes went on to the start of the drive, and continued right the way through on a good line, but once again managed to miss the cross-drive gates. By the time the sheep were shed for the penning, Pat had made few mistakes. The shed was neatly taken, and although quite a bit of time was used up in penning the first group of ewes, the ewes were well managed and stayed close to the mouth of the pen until the first ewe decided to turn into it. Unfortunately, so much time had been spent on this pen, there wasn't enough time to complete the course. Albeit these problems, Pat still managed a high 410 points, to take him into the lead of this event so far. Scotland's first handler in the brace competition had been Viv Billingham. Her partner in the Scottish team in 1990 was Stuart Davidson with Chief and Moss. Stuart's run started with having to whistle out his dogs before arriving behind the sheep on the point of the lift. This would have definitely hurt his scoring, but once on the fetch, things started to improve, with a good line through the gates and onto the handler's post. At the beginning of the drive, the sheep were offline, but this was well recovered, finishing up with a good line through the first panels, holding a direct line on the cross drive, only to end up missing the second set of drive gates. Things were looking good to this point. The shed was taken well and in good time. Once at the pen, the ewes became consistently difficult, with one of the sheep breaking back to the other group. Once the ewe had regrouped with the second five, the task of the new shed was necessary. This was now coming into the time, and Stuart's anxiety was starting to show. Eventually, the first penning was made, and with only minutes left, the second group was regrouped to complete the course. The usual problems that everyone else was having with penning the sheep continued here, and with the time running out, and just as the gate was about to close, the bell for time rang. With another 5 seconds, the course could have been completed. However, with the score of 337 points, the extra 10 for a clean final pen would have not helped Stewart in his final standings. The final run of the day was in the hands and experience of John Griffiths, a farmer from the Snowdonia region of Wales, running his 8-year-old Sam and 4-year-old Sweep. Both of these dogs are off John's own breeding. This run shaped up to be a real challenge to Pat Burns's run earlier on the Friday. The first part of the course was well handled, bringing the sheep on line to the handler's post and nicely around John onto the start of the drive. They held a good line on both the drive and the cross drive, but losing points on the last part of the drive before turning back to the shedding ring. Here some commands were poorly taken and driving the ewes away offline. This was corrected and the sheep were steadily brought back to the shedding ring. John's first penning was probably the best managed in the race so far, going on to complete the course for a total of 397, only 13 points behind young Pat Burns' score of 410. On the final tally, the brace finals looked like this. Thomas Longton narrowly missed second place with 387, but managed to prove his skills with the highest score on the first day with some awkward sheep. On the second day, Pat Burns highlighted this event, gaining much of his points on a faultless outrun. And so it was Ireland in the winning position, John Griffiths for Wales 13 points behind, and Thomas Longton in third place for England. For the final day of competition, the highest scoring 15 handlers in the qualifying trials reach an opportunity to compete for the Supreme Championship Shield. The list of qualifiers for 1990 are as follows. The course for the Supreme Championship. The Gather. A distance of about 800 yards for one lot of 10 sheep, which should be brought through the gate in the centre of the field to a post fixed 20 yards through the gate. The dog, having reached the post, will then be redirected for another lot of sheep, which should also be brought through the gate and united with the first lot. The first run to be right or left, as decided by the trials committee before the trial, and all competitors will run on that side. The second run to be to the other side. Should the gate be missed, no retry is allowed. Both the dog and the first lot of sheep must pass the gate to the post 20 yards inside the gate before the dog is redirected for the second lot. At the end of the fetch, the handler shall pass the sheep behind him. The drive. The drive shall be for 600 yards from where the handler stands in a triangular course through 2 gate obstacles back to the handler. The drive may be right or left as directed. Should the gate be missed, no retry is permitted at either gate. The drive should be in straight lines and ends when the sheep enters the shedding ring. The handler will remain at the post until the drive is finished. The shed. The 15 unmarked sheep to be shed off within a ring 40 yards in diameter. In shedding, the sheep will be passed between the handler and his dog, and the dog brought in to stop and turn back the marked sheep. Maneuvering for cuts is not allowed. Should any marked sheep leave the shedding ring and join any unmarked sheep already shed off, the unmarked sheep with which the marked sheep has joined will be brought back into the shedding ring and shedding restarted. Until the 15 unmarked sheep are shed off, penning will not be permitted. The pen. The 5 marked sheep must be penned and the gate shut. The pen will be 6 foot by 9 foot, with a gate 6 foot wide, to which is secured a rope 6 foot long. On completion of shedding, the handler must proceed to the pen, leaving the dog to bring the sheep to the pen. The handler is forbidden to assist his dog in driving the sheep to the pen. The handler will stand at the gate, holding the rope, and must not let go of the rope, whilst the dog works the sheep into the pen. The handler must close the gate. After releasing the sheep, the handler will close and fasten the gate. No points will be awarded for work done in the shedding ring or at the pen when either of these phases of work has not been completed within the prescribed time limit of 30 minutes. The scale of points for the Supreme. The gather 100 points, which is made up of each outrun 20 points, each lift 10 points, each fetch 20 points. The drive is awarded 40 points, the shedding 20 points, and the penning 10 points. This allows a total of 170 and an aggregate for 4 judges at 680. The finals on the Saturday began at 9 o'clock. The first handler in the Supreme was Billy Elliot with his 7-year-old Gale. The run began well with a good outrun for the first group of sheep, picking them up from their release point on the far left of the course, then bringing them on a good line to the fetch gates, but then just missing the gates. The second outrun lost points when Gale was being whistled back a number of times before reaching the ewes. Both the drive and the cross drive were well managed, on a fairly good line. But substantial points were lost when all but 3 of the ewes missed the gates, and then with the ewes going very wide before returning to the shedding ring. The shed proved quite a problem here, with the unmarked ewes leaving the ring a number of times, and then only to run out of time. Out of a possible 680 points, Billy managed 323, a disappointing day indeed. Marion Jones and his 7-year-old Spot won the Supreme at Blair Athol in 1988. They were absent from the finals at Margam Park last year, but this year were ready to give it their best on the trial field at Alnwick. The first outrun for the sheep on the left of the course required 2 redirections. Once with the ewes, Spot managed a good fetch, well on line through the trees and the rough ground, to a point a little higher than the gates. Then, with a very neat turn, brought the ewes around and through the gates and onto the fetch post, before redirecting Spot back for the second group of sheep. This second outrun didn't go quite so well, with a lot of redirection before the ewes were eventually picked up. At the start of the fetch, the ewes were badly offline, costing some more points, but Marion took the time to bring them back onto the correct line before continuing on with the fetch. From then on, the sheep fetched well, down through the gates before being regrouped for the last leg of the fetch. An international style shed always has the ability of erasing a few anxious moments. Marion's shed went fairly well, but on 2 occasions the ewes left the ring, which would have been costly. However, the shed was completed, and then, with only a few minutes left, brought the sheep to the pen. By the time Marion closed the gate, there was less than a minute to go before the bell. This had been a very sound run to score a total of 505 points. Aled Owen and his 8-year-old End were the 3rd Welsh competitors in the first 5 runs. As the handlers came and went, it was obvious that the 2 outruns with the sheep out of sight on both sides was to cause considerable problems for many of the competitors. Already in the trial, Glyn Jones had retired, unable to fetch the second group of ewes, and then 2 runs later, Johnny Bathgate's 9-year-old Vic took such a wide outrun that he disappeared completely, forcing them to retire. Here again, Aled Owen had to redirect his dog a number of times on both of his outruns, costing him considerable points. Throughout his whole fetch, he managed to keep the ewes very steady, but with his dog a fair distance from the sheep, he didn't have the control to turn them at the gates, and so missing the fetch gates on both of his gathers. Once he had managed his fetch, he went on to have a very sound drive and cross-drive, losing a few points, turning the ewes a little wide before bringing them back for the shed. Here Aled kept the ewes well settled, and by doing so managed a good shed. With the pen completed, he scored 470, some 35 points behind his fellow Welshman, Marion Jones. Out of the 15 finalists, only 2 handlers had managed to qualify for the English team. These were the captain of the English team, John Harrison, and this team of Thomas Longton and Tweed. Although every finalist would be seriously aiming for the winner's spot, Thomas must have been pleased with this run, especially after seeing the problems other well-known handlers such as Glyn Jones and Johnny Bathgate had had just before him. On his first outrun, he lost quite a few points on having to redirect Tweed. The start of the fetch was offline a little, but soon managed to get things rolling well. Then half of the ewes narrowly missed the fetch gates. The second outrun was taken with a few corrections. Once on the fetch, the sheep kept on a fairly good line, and almost missed the gates once again at the last moment. This was corrected well. Then to regather the first group and to bring the ewes around the handler's post for the start of the drive. Although Thomas managed to negotiate the sheep through the drive and cross-drive gates, points would have been lost with the ewes coming too low on the cross-drive, and then when they split on the return to the shedding ring. The shed was well handled, losing some points when the marked group left the ring. But once the shed was taken, the ewes were correctly driven to the pen and immediately penned. All in all, Thomas had a good run, scoring him 473 points. Wyn Edwards is no stranger when it comes to the battle for the Supreme Shield. In both 1981 and again in 1982, Wyn managed the rare achievement of winning the Supreme Championship in 2 successive years, both times with his dog Bill. This run scored well for Wynne, achieving the highest scoring outrun so far in the trial. He lost points noticeably on both of his fetches, by missing the gates with the first group and then coming badly offline after the lift with the second bunch of sheep. Once he regathered the 20 ewes, he went on to a high-scoring drive before arriving back at the shedding ring. The start of the shed went smoothly, but the last 2 ewes proved awkward to separate. Once this was completed, came the task of penning. This was made more difficult because of the closeness of the shed sheep. Although there were 2 attempted breaks by the marked sheep, once the ewes were in the mouth of the pen, the run was soon completed. This was the highest scoring run so far in the trial, finishing up with 561 points. 7 Welshmen qualified for the final day at this year's Supreme, and 5 of them had won the championship at some time in their career. With Scotland winning the team championship last year at Margam Park in South Wales, the strength of this Welsh team was in a good position to pry it back to Wales. Owen Daniels comes from a family of successful sheepdog handlers. His father had won the Supreme on 2 occasions, in 1949 and again in 1952, both with his dog Chip, the sire of Irwin's Ken, that in 1960 took Irwin to the winner's position at the International in Blackpool in England. His success throughout the years never managed to win him the International again, although coming close in 1968 when he won the Reserve Championship with Chip, a son of his Ken. Unfortunately, 1990 wasn't approved to be the year for Irwin's second championship either. Although he had a good scoring run, the necessary points needed to bring the Shield into focus just weren't there. The first outrun needed redirection, and then once on the start of the fetch, Fly rushed in to split the ewes, both of these situations costing on points. The second gather was quite a bit better, recovering some of the position lost earlier. The first part of the drive was a little offline, and then some of the ewes missed the gate at the end of the cross drive. The final part of the run was nicely executed, with a careful and steady shed, and then over to the pen, and with only a moment's pause, the sheep were past the opening and the gates closed. Alistair McRae was the next handler with his 5-year-old dog Butte. Alistair works as a shepherd at Goss Away in Kinross, and so is competing for the Scottish team. This was a run that Alistair will no doubt remember for a long time. His score of 582 is a reflection of the quality of work that was accomplished. The points that would have been lost throughout the run were not from any major problem. A redirection on both his first and second outrun would have slightly slimmed down his scores on these sections. Both of his fetches were well handled, and the sheep negotiated gates on both of them. The start of the drive was good, but a few points would have been dropped at the end of the cross drive, when the sheep almost missed the gates by coming too low on the drive line. The shed was handled well, with 6 ewes being taken off on the first cut, another 6th on the second cut, and then a single before managing to sort the last 2 from the marked sheep. One anxious moment could have dropped some points at the pen when one of the marked sheep broke back. However, the ewe regrouped with the 4 at the mouth of the pen, and then the gate was closed. So far, on the last day, the scores looked like this. Both Glyn Jones and Johnny Bathgate had retired following problems on the gather, and young Alistair McRae was well in the lead with just 6 runs to go. After qualifying with a good score of 371, Colin Gordon from Swansea in South Wales must have been very disappointed with this run for the championship. His first outrun was well taken with one redirection. His fetch was a little low, and this caused the ewe to come in below the gates instead of through them. The second outrun managed to reach the sheep, but quite a few redirections were given to achieve this. Still, Meg reached the ewes and started the fetch. The ewes pulled down to the handler far too much, and so a poor line would have caused some loss of points on this fetch as well. On both the drive and the cross drive, the sheep negotiated the gates, but the lines on the cross drive was very high. With the course completed, a score of 305 was given. Johnny Wilson completed the qualifying trial on Friday with less than a minute remaining. His 4-year-old Spot is a son of Raymond McPherson's Cap and out of Johnny's own well-known bitch Peg. This run of Spots started well, with a nice outrun and a good lift. The fetch was on a good line and then through the fetch gate to the post. A couple of strong whistles immediately took Spot off on his second outrun. Unfortunately, by the time he reached the second group of ewes, they were quite a distance away from their release point. This was corrected, and the ewes were brought back onto line, just missing the gates heading on to the last part of the fetch to the handler's post. The drive and the cross drive went well, although a zigzag before the first drive gates almost caused the sheep to miss them. Once back in the shedding ring, Johnny managed a good first cut. However, this was all in vain when a marked ewe managed to break away, causing all of the sheep to be regrouped and shedding to start again. This would have been costly on points. A break at the pen cost some more points before regrouping the ewes and then successfully closing the gate and completing the course. For most sheepdog enthusiasts, Wyn Jones needs little in the way of an introduction. An international supreme champion in 1974 and again in 1976, Gwyn came to Alnwick with his 8-year-old bitch Queen, a team that has seen many national and international events. His run in the qualifying trial gave him the lead going on into the final, the position that was held last year by Julie Deptford. This run alone speaks for itself. With a final score of 618 points, it is quite obvious that the few points that disappeared were minor at worst. On the second outrun, to the right of the field, a redirection to put Queen further back would have trimmed down an otherwise high score for the whole gather. The drive was of top quality and would have scored Gwyn well, but the shed that followed would have cost them most significant points, especially with the ewes leaving the ring the one time. However, by the time the gate swung closed at the pen, Gwyn and Queen had managed to pull well ahead of the rest of the field, some 36 points over the next highest score, that of Alistair McRae. The last three runs were the captains of their countries, with the exception of Heaven Jones, the Welsh captain, who had failed to qualify for the Supreme Finals. The first of these captains to run was John Harrison and his 5-year-old Craig, a son of John Templeton's Roy. Up until the second outrun, everything had gone well. Unfortunately, John had a great amount of difficulty in getting Craig to go back with the second group of sheep, out of sight on the far right of the course. After a considerable amount of time, Craig reached the sheep, but only managed it after crossing over and picking the ewes up from the wrong side. By this time, he had lost most of his points for the second outrun, and so it was best that he at least managed to reach the sheep and then carry on the course. Unfortunately, a situation like this can have a devastating effect on the remainder of the run, losing concentration and confidence. The line on the drive was good, but the gates were missed, and so more valuable points would have gone. Points that he couldn't really afford to lose if he was to secure anything of a final position. The final part of the course was handled well. The shed was nicely managed with a good initial cut and then finishing up with a high-scoring pen. With all the problems that John encountered on this run, he still managed well to recover the situation to allow for a good finish and scoring him a final total of 435. Joe McRoberts and his 6-year-old Glenn were the second to last to compete in this year's International. Having won the Scottish National this year, Joe was full of hope going into the Alnwick trial. He had scored well in the qualifying, which would have given him some extra confidence, but the competition was strong and the double lift course had shown to be difficult even with the very best of handlers. The first outrun was taken well, but needed one redirection, a situation that had proved to be needed for most of the dogs. His second outrun would have cost him some points, with several redirections to put Glenn back over the brow of the hill to pick up the second group. The second fetch was again very steady, and the sheep were well settled, moving well through the gates and onto the handler's post. His few problems on the second outrun were made up by an excellent drive and cross-drive, maintaining a direct line and moving the sheep at a constant pace through the whole section of the course. The start of the shed caused some problems, but as time went along, Joe was able to make some good cuts and soon managed to take off the unmarked sheep before moving on to the pen. Joe certainly managed a top-class run, scoring him 569 points, and with just one handler remaining, placing him in the third position so far. And so, for the last run of the day, Ireland's captain for 1990, Toddy Lamb, and his 6-year-old Nell. The anxiety of waiting through all of the other runs must tell on any handler. The prospects of that double lift that so few of the handlers manage to get right without redirecting the dogs, and for some causing their retirement, and then the prospects of the international style shed with the alert and powerful sheep that all the handlers had experienced on the previous 2 days. And then knowing that to win, one would need to improve upon the steady and smooth runs of Gwyn Jones, Alistair McRae, and the previous run of Joe McRoberts. Toddy's run was handled well, losing some valuable points on the second outrun, trying to push Nell back to the ewes. Whereas he narrowly missed the first fetch gates, he went on to lift and fetch the second group of sheep well, directing them correctly through the panels and onto the handler's post. He scored well on his drive, keeping the ewes on a good line and negotiating both sets of gates. The shed proved a major problem though, and eventually time ran out only a few minutes after the shed was completed, and so no time to score for the pen. As he had managed to complete the shed, he would have got some shedding points, but they would have been trimmed down because the sheep left the ring several times. The prizes for the 1990 championship were: the English Shepherd's Trophy was won by Ray Edwards and Glenn. The Scottish Shepherd's Trophy was won by Joe McRoberts and Glenn. The Welsh Shepherd's Trophy was not awarded this year because none of the Welshmen that qualified were shepherds. And then finally, the Irish Shepherd's Trophy went to Peter Concannon and Chip. The Brace Championship went to Ireland and Pat Burns Jr. with Star and Dot, both sons of John Templeton's Roy. And then the Supreme Championship trophy went to Gwyn Jones and Queen. The remainder of the placings for the finals were as follows: